that in Ferguson 94% of the police are white and 63% of the people are black. Forget that 92% of police searches and 86% of car stops are for black people. Forget that the white municipal government finances nearly a quarter of its annual budget through the fines and penalties disproportionately leveled against the black portion of the population.
All right. So he is upset that blacks are disproportionately arrested or stopped or fined. But what about the fact that blacks commit a disproportionate amount of the crime? Should that be overlooked? Blacks statistically are 8 times as likely to commit a robbery than white. So what does that mean? I mean, if your town is 67% black, I mean, pretty much there's a lot of blacks that are going to be committing a lot of crimes. The statistics make sense. Why don't they go? Why don't they go and get the arrest records of the black policemen and compare them to the arrest records of the white policemen? I bet if you did that, you'd find that the black cops are arresting the same percentage of blacks as the white cops. They're not racist. This is just the numbers. You know, you're talking about, oh, all these, blacks, whites are gunning down blacks. I read the statistics. Of all the black murders per year, 3% of blacks are murdered by whites. 3%. Despite the fact that the country is more than half white, right? Only 3% of the blacks who are murdered by whites. However, for white people, I read that 45% of whites are murdered by blacks. Despite the fact that blacks are only 13% of the population, if you're white and you're murdered, there's a 45% chance that it was a black person who murdered you. So, whites seem to have a lot more to fear that they're going to be murdered by a black than a black has to fear that they are going to be murdered by a white. But you see, John Stewart, assumes, well, people don't know. I'll just say, well, 65% are black and 85% of blacks are arrested. Therefore, these cops are racist. Therefore, they're not racist. That has nothing to do with it. But here's where it gets worse, where he talks about how difficult it is to be black in America. And he uses the example of a cab driver. Here, it's cut number 11.
Imagine that instead of that, on a pretty consistent basis, you can't get a f***ing cab, even though you're a neurosurgeon, because you're black. I guarantee you that every person of color in this country has faced an indignity, from the ridiculous to the grotesque to the sometimes fatal, at some point in their, I'm going to say, last couple of hours.
All right.
Because of their skin color.
Now, okay, first of all, I am not going to disagree with John Stewart that in many cases, blacks may find it more difficult to hail a cab than whites. I'm not saying that that doesn't happen, but it's not because of racism. And yes, if you're a neurosurgeon and if you're dressed in a suit and you're in a certain neighborhood, you might not have a hard time getting a cab. But if you're a neurosurgeon and you're dressed in a hoodie, that might raise the chances that the cab driver might not want to pick you up. But it's not because the cab drivers are a bunch of white racists. In fact, most of the cab drivers are probably not white. I mean, I take cabs sometimes, and usually they're immigrants. They're people coming in from Pakistan or India or Jamaica or some other Caribbean island. If they're white, maybe they're Russian. I mean, they didn't grow up in white, racist America, right? And many of the cab drivers, again, are black. And my guess, and I think this is not a guess statistically, that a black cab driver is just as likely to bypass a potential black customer as a white cab driver. And is it because the black cab driver is racist against his own people? No. If blacks statistically commit a lot more crimes than whites, which they do, and if you're a cab driver, what are the risks that you have as a cab driver? You could pick up somebody and they don't pay you. At the end of the drive, they just take off and you get stiffed. Worse yet, they can rob you. They can take the money that you've already earned, especially if it's later in the day and you've got a lot of cash. Or they can take you into a bad neighborhood where somebody else robs you. And so maybe the odds of that happening to you are greater when you pick up a young black male, for example, than an elderly white female or white male, whatever it is. If that is your experience and you're a cab driver and you're black or white or whatever race you are, and you don't want to get mugged and you don't want to get stiffed, and the odds are greater right, that if you pick up a black guy, that is going to happen to you, then you're not going to do it. Now, can I feel sorry for the honest black man? The vast majority of black men are honest. They will pay. They're not going to rob the cab driver. But the cab driver doesn't know which ones are the good ones and which ones are the bad ones. He has to go based on probability. So if there's two people flagging a cab, you're going to pick up the guy who you think has a less likely chance of robbing you or stiffing you. Right? That's what you're going to do, black or white. And whose fault is that? See, this is what Jon Stewart doesn't understand. Whose fault is it? It's not the white guy's fault or the black guy's fault who doesn't pick up the black man. It's all those other black men that are giving blacks a bad name. So if you're black and you're pissed off that a cab driver just went right by you and picked up a white guy and didn't pick up you, don't blame the cab driver because he may in fact be black. He may be just as black as you are, but blame the high percentage of blacks who commit all these crimes. And now the question of why do they do that? Well, that's another story. Because it's not that blacks are genetically predisposed to crime. You're not born a criminal. You are raised a criminal. And that's a whole different subject as to why so many blacks end up being criminals. And of course, I have a lot of explanations for that, but I don't have time to get into it. But Jon Stewart has a lot to learn.